Santa Catalina Island, California, August 3, 1913, 7 in the morning. Ralph Gliddon was 44 years old and had been digging in the ground professionally for 21 years. He was the kind of archaeologist that the discipline produced at the turn of the century. Methodical, quiet, deeply suspicious of conclusions. A man who measured twice and wrote once, and who had spent a career building a reputation for findings that other researchers could replicate without argument. He had worked mounds in Ohio, shell middens in Virginia, burial sites in coastal Georgia, and in every case his field notes had been so precise that his publications had been cited without controversy. He was not a theorist. He was a recorder of physical facts. He had come to Santa Catalina Island in the summer of 1913 because a preliminary survey conducted the previous year by a graduate student from the University of Southern California had found a concentration of anomalous surface material, broken ceramic and worked bone, in the island's interior that suggested a burial complex larger than anything previously documented on the Channel Islands. Ralph Gliddon was not prepared for what the island had buried. He began excavating on July 14th, 2 weeks before the morning that changed the nature of the project and the nature of his career. The first 2 weeks produced what he had expected: standard Gabrielino burial sites, the island's ancestral population, with material culture consistent with what coastal California archaeology had documented across 100 similar sites. He was satisfied. He was building a clean record. His field notes from July 14th through August 2nd, which survive in fragmentary form in the Braun Research Library at the Autry National Center in Los Angeles, are a model of professional excavation record. Layer depth, soil composition, skeletal orientation, associated material, state of preservation. The hand is steady. The measurements are in pencil, carefully done. On the morning of August 3rd, Ralph Gliddon's trowel found a different kind of bone. The island's interior hills had been channeling water for centuries into a basin on the northeastern slope, and the accumulated sediment at the basin's base had preserved the material below it with unusual completeness. When Gliddon's crew cleared the overburden at that location, working down through 40 inches of dense clay mixed with shell, they found a burial layer that was physically distinct from anything they had opened in the preceding 2 weeks. The bones were larger, not marginally larger, substantially larger. The femur of the first figure Gliddon measured, lying at a slight angle to the north-south axis of the burial, was 31 inches long. A standard human femur ranges from 16 to 20 inches. A femur of 31 inches belongs to a figure standing, by standard anatomical proportion, at approximately 7 feet 4 inches. He measured it 4 times. It was 31 inches each time. He called his assistant, a 23-year-old from UCLA named Porter Crandall, who was in his first field season, and had Crandall measure it independently. Crandall produced 31 1/4 inches. Gliddon recorded 31 inches and moved on. What he found over 3 seasons at that basin site, the summers of 1913, 1914, and 1915, constituted the most systematically anomalous burial complex ever documented on the Pacific coast of North America. 264 individuals. The count is precise. Gliddon numbered each burial in sequence and maintained a running catalog. Of those 264 individuals, 172 fell within the normal range of Gabrielino skeletal dimensions. The remaining 92 did not. 61 of those 92 exceeded 7 feet in estimated standing height. The tallest, a figure Gliddon labeled Burial 247 in his catalog, had a femur of 37 inches and a tibia of 27 inches, producing an estimated standing height of between 8 feet 6 inches and 9 feet. This was a single population. The two groups, normal-sized and oversized, were interred in the same layer, in the same basin, with the same associated material culture. They were the same people. One people with a size distribution that has no parallel in any documented human population in the ethnographic or archaeological record. The skulls were not normal. Gliddon documented this with the same precision he applied to the long bones. He used a water fill method, filling each skull through the foramen magnum and measuring the volume of water displaced. The standard human cranial capacity ranges from 1,000 to 1,600 cubic centimeters. Gliddon's measurements for the oversized individuals averaged 2,100 cubic centimeters. The highest measured value, burial 247 again, was 2,480 cubic centimeters, 55% larger than the upper limit of the standard human range. The skulls had no sagittal suture. The sagittal suture is the joint that runs along the top of the human skull from front to back, connecting the two parietal bones. It is present in every anatomically modern human being. In 44 of the 92 oversized individuals from the Catalina Basin site, Ralph Gliddon documented the complete absence of any sagittal suture. Not fused suture, absent suture. The parietal bones in those 44 individuals formed a single continuous plate with no structural division. Gliddon had never seen this. He spent 3 evenings in his field tent with every cranial anatomy reference he had brought and found no description of this condition as anything other than a pathological anomaly in isolated individual cases. 44 cases in a single population was not a pathological anomaly. It was an anatomical characteristic. He wrote about this in his field notes with the same level tone he used for femur measurements. The notes record the dimensions, the presence or absence of suture, the cranial capacity measurement, and no editorial comment. He understood what he was finding. He continued digging. His field notes survive in 3 fragments. The first covers 60 days of the first season. The second covers the first 5 weeks of the second season. The third, 7 loose pages, covers scattered dates in 1915. The complete field notes from 3 seasons, which Gliddon described in a letter to his colleague Arthur Woodward at the Natural History Museum of Los Angeles County, as filling 4 bound volumes of his standard field notebook, do not exist in any accessible archive. The 3 fragments survive only because Gliddon sent them to Woodward as preliminary documentation in advance of a publication he was planning. The 1915 fragment, the most significant surviving section, describes material from the final season that changed the nature of the find entirely. The season's opening entry notes, the most completely preserved material of the 3 seasons, in a condition that permits detailed anatomical assessment of soft tissue characteristics not accessible in the earlier sections. Soft tissue. In a sealed sediment layer, preserved by the island's dry interior climate and the alkalinity of the basin soil, the 1915 burials were mummified. The subsequent entries describe 4 individuals, designated in Gliddon's numbering as burials 231, 238, 244, and 261, with preserved tissue sufficient for external description. The descriptions are brief and professional. Burial 231, estimated standing height 8 feet 2 inches, preserved skin coloration described as notably pale, paler than any coastal California population documented in the literature. Burial 238, hair preserved at the cranial vault, coloration red gold, texture coarse, length at time of burial estimated at approximately 8 inches. Burial 244, facial features preserved, brow ridge pronounced, consistent with the cranial architecture of the anomalous group. Burial 261, the largest individual in the section, estimated standing height 9 feet, soft tissue preservation complete from the waist to the crown. Red gold hair. In a population of 92 anomalous individuals, 4 documented in a single fragment with this characteristic, a fragment covering only a fraction of the 1915 season, suggests a hair coloration pattern that may have been common across the anomalous group. Red hair coloration in pre-Columbian North American populations is not a characteristic of any documented indigenous people of the California coast or the Channel Islands. It appears in the broader anomalous American find record at Lovelock Cave in Nevada, documented in 1924, and at several other Great Basin cave sites across the period 1890 through 1930. The Catalina Island population, by Gliddon's 1915 stratigraphy, predates all of them. The 4 full volumes of field notes that Gliddon described to Arthur Woodward are not at the Autry National Center. They are not at any University of Southern California archive. They are not in any repository whose holdings have been searched by independent researchers in the intervening century. An agent of the Bureau of American Ethnology, a 37-year-old physical anthropologist named Theodore Braxton, whose travel to the Channel Islands in April 1919 is documented in the Bureau's administrative records, was on Santa Catalina Island from April 17th through May 3rd of that year, 16 days. Ralph Gliddon was also on the island during that period, working what became his final field season. Gliddon left the island on May 2nd, one day before Braxton's departure. After May 1919, Ralph Gliddon published nothing more on the Catalina material. He published nothing more on the Catalina material at any point before his death in 1941. The Bureau's field report for Braxton's 16 days does not exist in any accessible institutional file. The Bureau's accession records for human remains received in 1919 contain a gap in the entries covering exactly the Channel Islands period. A Freedom of Information request filed in December 2020 by the researcher Linda Marsh, requesting all Bureau field reports for the Channel Islands for the period 1900 through 1930, received a partial response. 8 documents were provided, covering other Channel Islands sites. Documents relating to Santa Catalina Island specifically were withheld under Exemption 6, which covers personal privacy interests. Exemption 6 does not legally apply to field reports for archaeological work conducted more than 100 years ago on a deceased subject's professional activity. Between 1913 and 1919, Ralph Gliddon was one of the most consistently published archaeologists working on the Pacific coast. 11 articles in the American Anthropologist in that period, 3 in the Journal of the Anthropological Institute of Great Britain. After 1919, the record stops. He was 50 years old, in good health, at the height of his professional credentials. He remained on the University of Southern California faculty through 1928, teaching courses whose syllabi, held in the USC Registrar's Archive, covered standard California coastal archaeology with no reference to anomalous finds. One of his students from that period, a man named Robert Fitch, recalled in a 1962 oral history project conducted by the California Archaeological Society that he had once asked Gliddon after class about an article referencing the Catalina work. Gliddon responded with a single sentence: "The record from that period is incomplete." Then he asked Fitch about his own fieldwork. The land that includes the basin site on the northeastern slope of Santa Catalina Island has been held by the Catalina Island Conservancy since 1972. The Conservancy is a non-profit organization incorporated in California, whose founding donors included foundations with documented connections to federal land management contractors. The basin site is in a restricted access zone, not accessible to the public, not on any published trail system, not included in the Conservancy's public archaeological program. A letter sent to the Conservancy's research director in February 2019 by a California State University researcher requesting access for a Channel Islands population study received a response declining on grounds of site sensitivity. The response did not cite any specific permit process or appeal mechanism. The technical impossibility at the center of the Catalina Island case is not the size. Size variations, however extreme, can be argued within the range of population genetics. The sagittal suture absence cannot. The sagittal suture is not a variable characteristic in anatomically modern Homo sapiens. Its systematic absence in 44 of 92 individuals from a single burial complex, a frequency of 48%, describes a population whose cranial anatomy was categorically different from anatomically modern humans. This is not a cultural argument. It is not a dating argument. It is an anatomy argument. The bones either have a sagittal suture or they do not. These are physical facts that do not become less physical when the objects that embody them are moved into a restricted access archive and removed from the record. The glass plate photograph that Gliddon took of burial 247, the largest individual with a femur of 37 inches, is in the Braun Research Library file alongside the surviving fragments. The photograph shows a skeletal figure in situ, the surrounding soil not yet fully cleared, the enormous long bones visible against the dark sediment. The skull is partially visible at the upper edge of the frame. The sagittal suture line, the join that runs along the top of a normal human skull, is not visible. The cranial vault is a single unbroken curve of bone. Gliddon took the photograph from approximately 3 feet above the burial, looking down. The femur extends across most of the frame. It is 31 inches long at the short end, 37 at the long. Ralph Gliddon retired to Pasadena in 1928 and died there in 1941. His personal papers were not donated to any archive. The estate was managed by a nephew who had no professional connection to archaeology, and who, in a brief note sent to the USC Library in 1943, declining a request for the papers, described them as of no scholarly interest. Ralph Gliddon was 44 years old on the morning of August 3, 1913, when his trowel found a bone that was not the right size. He measured it 4 times. He had his assistant measure it. He recorded the number and moved on because there were 263 more to document, and he was a man who documented things. He spent 3 seasons doing the most systematic work of his career and produced a set of field notes whose physical characteristics, 4 bound volumes in his consistent pencil hand, with numbered entries and measured dimensions, were specific enough that their absence from every accessible archive is not a filing error. Specific objects in specific quantities do not vanish from professional archives through negligence. They vanish through intention. The basin is still there, in the restricted zone on the northeastern slope of the island, behind the Conservancy's access boundary. The layer that Ralph Gliddon opened is still below the surface at 40 inches of clay and shell. Whatever he left in place when the 1919 season ended is still there, at that depth, in that basin, in the particular darkness of a sealed sediment layer. The trowel has not touched it since 1919. The femur is still there. 37 inches of bone, in the ground, in the position Gliddon photographed it, in a darkness that has been unbroken since before anyone now living was born. The publication that Ralph Gliddon never produced was not a small academic note. It was, by the standards of the period, a career-defining monograph. A find of 264 individuals, the largest systematic excavation on the Channel Islands to that date, with subpopulations showing characteristics never documented in the North American archaeological record. Arthur Woodward, writing to Gliddon in March 1916, described the expected publication as the most important contribution to California coastal archaeology since the Great Mound surveys of the 90s. He underlined the word important and added in a marginal note that he had already spoken to the American Anthropologist's editor about expedited review. The publication never reached the American Anthropologist. It never reached any journal. The correspondence between Woodward and Gliddon from 1916 through 1919 shows a man who was intending to publish, and then, in the specific window between April and May 1919, the window that coincides with Theodore Braxton's 16 days on the island, stopped intending to publish and never returned to the subject. Woodward's letter to Gliddon of October 1919, 5 months after Gliddon left the island for the last time, is the most significant document in the surviving correspondence for what it does not contain. It is a professional letter, collegial in tone, discussing several topics: a grant application at the Natural History Museum, an upcoming conference in Berkeley, a promising graduate student whose work both men admired. There is no mention of the Catalina publication, no inquiry about its progress, no follow-up on the expedited review Woodward had arranged with the American Anthropologist's editor 3 years earlier. The subject is not raised and not acknowledged as having been dropped. It is simply absent from a letter between two professional colleagues for whom it had been, 18 months prior, a central professional concern. The correspondence files do not contain Gliddon's reply to the October 1919 letter. His reply to every previous letter in the series is present. Only the October 1919 reply is absent. The nearest physical parallel to the Catalina Island population in the global archaeological record is not from North America. The Paracas culture of coastal Peru, documented through mummy excavations beginning in the late 19th century and extended by the Peruvian archaeologist Julio Tello in the 1920s, produced elongated skulls with cranial volumes averaging 20 to 25% above the standard human range. The Paracas skulls show the same pattern of absent or substantially reduced sagittal suture that Gliddon documented at Catalina. The Paracas material has been analyzed by independent researchers using modern DNA extraction techniques, and the results, published by the researcher Brian Forrester in 2018, working with a laboratory in Texas, indicate mitochondrial DNA haplogroups that do not correspond to any known Native American, Asian, or European population. The results have not been replicated in a peer-reviewed study. They have also not been refuted by a peer-reviewed study. The institutional response to the Paracas DNA analysis has been identical to the institutional response to the Catalina Island find. Silence. The economic architecture supporting the Catalina site's inaccessibility is worth examining in its own right. The Catalina Island Conservancy, which controls the restricted zone where the basin site is located, is a non-profit organization, a category of legal entity that is not subject to the same freedom of information requirements as federal institutions. Its internal records, including any archaeological survey data it may hold for the restricted zone, are not accessible through standard federal disclosure mechanisms. A researcher seeking the Catalina Island Basin site data faces a three-layer institutional barrier. The Federal Bureau of American Ethnology holds records subject to freedom of information, but has withheld them under an inapplicable exemption. The Conservancy holds land records that are not subject to federal disclosure requirements. And the University of Southern California, which might be expected to hold Gliddon's institutional records from his tenure there, reports that his personal research files from the 1913 through 1919 period were not deposited with the university when he retired and were not recovered from his estate after his death. 3 institutions, 3 walls. The find that Arthur Woodward called the most important contribution to California coastal archaeology in a generation is accessible today only through 3 loose fragments in the Braun Research Library and the glass plate photograph of a femur. The femur is 37 inches long. The suture line on the skull above it is absent. Both of those facts are still true. They have been true since August 3, 1913, when a 44-year-old archaeologist measured a bone 4 times and wrote down the number and moved on to the next. The site itself sits in the restricted zone of an island that receives roughly 1 million tourists per year. The ferry runs from Long Beach and San Pedro daily during summer months. The tourists visit the village of Avalon, the Glass Bottom Boat Tour, the Casino Ballroom. None of them go to the northeastern slope, to the basin, to the 40 inches of clay and shell above the layer where Ralph Gliddon's trowel moved for 3 summers. The Conservancy's trail maps show the hiking routes open to the public. The restricted zone is unmarked on the maps. Not marked as restricted, not marked at all. It is simply absent from the cartography. The absence is a form of management. The layer that contained 264 individuals, 92 of them outside the human skeletal range, 44 of them without a sagittal suture, 4 of them mummified with red gold hair preserved at the cranial vault, is below a section of island that does not appear on the maps that tourists carry. It has been below that ground since before the Conservancy existed, before the ferry ran, before anyone thought to map what the island contained. The basin is still there. The layer is still sealed. The suture line is still absent. Ralph Gliddon measured everything he found, and what he found is still in the ground at the depth where he found it. There is one additional physical detail from Gliddon's surviving 1915 fragment that no published account has examined closely. The 7 loose pages that constitute the third fragment include a measurement table for the 4 mummified individuals, a table organized with the same column structure Gliddon used throughout his field notes: burial number, estimated height, long bone measurements, cranial capacity, suture status, tissue preservation notes, and a final column headed Associated. In the first 3 seasons' notes, the Associated column was almost uniformly empty. The Catalina burials had no grave goods, which Gliddon noted repeatedly as itself anomalous for a population of this scale and apparent cultural sophistication. In the 1915 fragments measurement table, the Associated column for burial 261, the 9-foot individual with complete soft tissue preservation, contains a single entry: disc, gray, approximately 8 inches, chest. An 8-inch gray disc resting on the sternum of a 9-foot mummified figure at 200 feet of Holocene sediment in the northeastern slope basin of Santa Catalina Island. Gliddon did not describe the disc further in the surviving pages. The disc is not mentioned in any of the 3 fragments before or after this entry. It appears once, in a measurement table, as a single column entry, and then it disappears into the gap between what the fragments preserve and what the 4 full volumes contained. The global record of gray disk objects found in association with anomalous skeletal remains in sealed North American contexts is small but internally consistent. St. Francois County, Missouri, 1891. 11 gray discs on 11 chests in a sealed mine chamber at 310 feet. Catalina Island, California, 1915. 1 gray disc on the chest of the largest mummified individual in a sealed sediment layer at 40 inches depth, documented by a careful archaeologist and then absorbed into a set of field notes that left the island in Theodore Braxton's custody in May 1919 and have not appeared in any accessible archive since. 2 sites separated by more than 1,000 miles, more than 20 years, and entirely different institutional trajectories, producing the same gray disc on the same chest. The sites are not connected by any known cultural framework. They are connected by a physical object, appearing in consistent context, documented by credentialed professionals in both cases, and inaccessible in both cases after federal involvement. The question that the 2 sites pose together is one that neither the official archaeological record nor the official institutional record acknowledges as a question. It is asked only by the physical evidence itself, from wherever that evidence currently sits, in whatever facility holds the 4 volumes of Ralph Gliddon's Catalina field notes without an accession number and the gray disc from burial 261 without a catalog entry, in the dark of a storage room that no Freedom of Information request has yet successfully identified.